This story sits in a strange place, between documented history and underworld legend. Some of it comes from court records, newspaper archives, and testimony given decades later. A lot of it comes from biographies, written long after the fact, from journalists who interviewed people who claimed to have been close to the events, and from stories that circulated in Harlem for years before anyone wrote them down. Some of the details line up across multiple sources, others don't, and in a few cases, nobody has ever been able to confirm them at all. What follows is an attempt to lay out the story the way it's usually told, while being honest about which parts are solid ground and which parts are closer to legend that grew up around a real conflict. With that said, here's how the story usually goes. 4 men reportedly walked into a Harlem nightclub late one Friday night, sent, according to most tellings, by one of the most feared crime families in the country to deliver a message. This story sits in a strange place, according to documented history, didn't go the way anyone downtown expected. Some of it comes from court records, most versions of newspaper archives. It was the Genovese family that ended up on the receiving end of a message from biographies written long after the fact. And it's worth saying up front who interviewed that most of the claimed to have been details inside it are disputed, and from stories that circulated in Harlem for simply unconfirmed by any surviving official record. Some of the details line up across multiple sources, that a conflict took place in 1943, and in a few cases between nobody has never been able to confirm them elements of the Genovese family is an attempt to lay out the story the way it's usually studied organized crime being honest about which parts are solid ground, the notes, and which parts are closer to legend, the exact conversations around a real almost entirely from accounts written or told. Here's how the story usually goes, and should be treated that way. 4 men reportedly walked into a Harlem nightclub late one Friday night. It helps to look at what New York looked like at the end of the most feared crime families in the country. The city's underworld was still associated with the Genovese name, according to later accounts, even though the man it was named after wasn't around to run it. Vito Genovese had left the country in 1937. It was the Genovese family fleeing to Italy ahead of a murder charge. Message instead. And by most accounts, that's the short years afterward. And it's cultivating relationships with Mussolini's government. Specific details apparently under the impression that fascist Italy offered more safety unconfirmed by any surviving official records. Day-to-day leadership of the family fell to Frank Costello, took place in 1943, generally described as more of a behind-the-scenes elements of the Genovese family, is generally accepted by historians who studied organized crime in this police officials, the specific city politicians, the notes, rather than the meetings, open displays, the exact conversations. Costello's approach entirely from accounts fairly well documented, well compared to a lot of what follows in this story. Contemporary accounts why this conflict happened at all. Careful man to look at what New York looked like at the end of 1942, whenever he could manage it. Underworld someone who still treated most with the Genovese name to be solved, even though the man it was named after wasn't around to run it. That reputation is part of why several historians find it notable that the Harlem conflict escalated ahead of a murder charge, as far as it apparently did. By most accounts, since it doesn't fully match the pattern of how relationships otherwise remembered operating, apparently under the impression that fascist Italy offered Italian crime family staying operated under a loose governing structure. Day-to-day leadership of the family fell to Frank Costello, an arrangement historians generally describe as more of a behind-the-scenes set up in the aftermath of a period of internal warfare influence that had proven costly for everyone involved. Police officials, by most city politicians, the commission, rather than 1942, functioned less like a battlefield. Costello's approach to leadership like a loose, fairly well documented, managed compared to a lot of without resorting to open conflict. Contemporary accounts between families as a quiet, to draw exactly the kind of negotiation and favors that made ordinary business whenever he could manage it. Most of the city's territory had been informally divided along these rather than for years to be won outright. Harlem, however, that reputation is part of why several generated a level of income that made it the Harlem conflict downtown as far as it apparently did. The reason Harlem mattered so much pattern of how Costello is otherwise remembered operating, according to most historical accounts, by the early 1940s, but the numbers racket Italian crime and informal lottery that had operated in black neighborhoods for decades usually before Italian organized crime ever took an interest. An arrangement historians trace back to the early 1930s, 3-digit number drawn later that aftermath of a period of internal warfare difficult to manipulate, proven costly such as the closing totals at a racetrack. By most accounts, payouts could run several hundred to 1. By 1942, functioned less like a battlefield and more
but the game
like
cost
a loose
almost
council
nothing to
trying
play,
to manage
paid out in
disputes
cash,
without
and
resorting
functioned
to
in
open
neighborhoods
conflict.
with little access
Since
to
violence
formal banking
between families
as something closer
tended
to
to
a
draw
community
exactly
lottery
the kind
than
of
a police
straightforward
and press
con.
attention
Historical
that made
estimates
ordinary
of how much
business
money
harder
moved
to
through
run.
Harlem's numbers
Most of the
economy
city's territory
vary,
had been
but
informally
most accounts
divided
agree
along
it was
these lines for
substantial.
years,
likely in the
Harlem,
hundreds of
however,
thousands of
sat
dollars a
outside
week
that structure
citywide,
and generated a level of income that made it hard for
whoever
the families
controlled the
downtown
largest
to
share of
simply
that
leave
business
alone.
controlled
The
a
reason
significant,
Harlem mattered
steady
so
source
much
of income,
financially,
and by
wasn't
most
narcotics
accounts,
or
the largest
extortion,
individual
according to
operator
most
in
historical
Harlem at the
accounts,
time
was
the
the numbers
numbers
racket,
Raymond Johnson,
an informal
known to
lottery
nearly
that had
everyone
operated
as
in
Bumpy,
black neighborhoods
a
for
nickname
decades
tied to
before
a bump
Italian
on the back of his
organized
skull
crime ever
that
took an
dated into
interest.
childhood.
Players
Johnson's
would bet small
biography
amounts on
is
a
better
three-digit
documented
number
than a
drawn
lot of
later
what
that
comes
day,
later in this
often
story,
tied to a
though
source
even
that was
here,
difficult to
sources
manipulate,
sometimes
such as
disagree
the
on
closing
details.
totals at a racetrack.
He's generally understood to have
Payouts could
grown
run
up in
several
South Carolina,
hundred to one,
moved to Harlem as a
The
teenager,
odds heavily
and
favored
come of
the
age during the
operators,
years
but
the
the game
neighborhood
cost
became a
almost
center of
nothing to
black
play,
cultural
paid
life
out
in
in
America.
cash.
Multiple
functioned in
biographers
neighborhoods with
describe
little
him
access
as an
to formal
unusually
banking,
well-read
as something
man
closer
for
to a
someone in
community
his
line
line
of
of
work
work than a straightforward
someone
con.
who reportedly
Historical
enjoyed
estimates
poetry
of how
and
much
chess
money moved through
and was
Harlem's
known for
numbers
dressing
economy
carefully,
vary, and
but
speaking
most
in a
accounts
measured,
agree it was
deliberate
substantial.
way.
He
Likely
served
in the
time at
hundreds of
Sing Sing
thousands of
earlier in
dollars
his
a
career,
week,
citywide,
and, according
by
to
the
most
early
accounts,
1940s.
worked his way up through
Whoever
Harlem's
controlled the
underworld
largest
over
share
roughly
of that
2
business,
decades,
controlled
eventually
a
becoming a close
steady
associate
source of
and
income,
enforcer for
and by
Stephanie
most
St.
accounts,
Clair. The
a
largest
numbers
individual operator
who had run
in
one of
Harlem's
Harlem's
largest gambling
was
operations
Ellsworth
in the
Raymond
1920s,
Johnson,
known to nearly
1930s,
everyone as
and
Bumpy,
who had, by
a
most
nickname
tellings,
tied to a bump on the
successfully
back of his
resisted
skull
an earlier
that
attempt
dated
by
to
the
childhood.
white gangster Dutch Schultz
Johnson's
to take
biography
over her
is
territory
better
by
documented
force
than a
in
lot
the
of
early
what
part
comes
of that
later in
decade.
the story.
By the
Though
early
even here,
1940s,
sources
St.
sometimes
Clair had
disagree on
stepped
details.
back from active
He's
operations,
generally understood
and
to have
Johnson
grown
had
up in South
reportedly
Carolina,
become the most
moved to
prominent
Harlem as a
figure in
teenager,
Harlem's numbers
and come of
business,
age during the
believed
years the
by most
neighborhood became a
accounts
center
to
of
control
black
the
cultural
largest
life in
single
America.
operation in the
Multiple
neighborhood.
biographers
It's worth
describe
spending
him
a
as an
moment on what
unusually
Harlem looked
well-read
like at that
man
point,
for someone in his
since it
line
helps
of work.
explain why
Someone
Johnson
who
had the
reportedly
kind of
enjoyed
standing he
poetry
apparently
and
did.
chess,
The
and
neighborhood
was known for
cultural
dressing
high point
carefully
in the 1920s
and speaking in a
had
measured,
faded considerably
deliberate way.
by the early 1940s.
He served time at Sing Sing.
The Depression
earlier in his
hit Harlem
career,
harder than a
and,
lot of
according
the
to
rest
most
of
of
the
accounts,
city.
worked his way up through Harlem's underworld
many of the
over roughly
businesses
2
that had
decades,
once defined the
eventually
area's
becoming
main
a close
streets
associate
had
and
closed.
enforcer for Stephanie
Against
St.
that
Clair.
backdrop,
A numbers
historians
operator
who
who
study
had
the
run one of
numbers
Harlem's
racket
largest
generally
gambling
describe it as
operations
something
in the
more
1920s
complicated
and
than simple
1930s,
criminal
and who
exploitation.
had, by most tellings,
For a lot of people
successfully
who
resisted
played,
an earlier
it functioned
attempt
as
by
one
the
of the
white
only
gangster Dutch
accessible
Schultz
forms of hope
to take over her
available on an
territory by
ordinary day
force in the
a
early
small,
part of that decade.
affordable,
By the
recurring
early
chance to turn a nickel
1940s,
or a
St.
quarter
Clair had
into
stepped
something
back
meaningful.
from active operations.
That context
and
matters,
Johnson had
because
reportedly
it's part
become
of why
the
the
most
men who
prominent
ran
figure in
Harlem's
Harlem's
numbers
numbers
business
could develop a
believed
kind
by
of
most
standing in
accounts
their
to
communities
control the
that had
largest
little
single
to do with how
operation
the
in the
law viewed
neighborhood.
them.
It's
Several
worth spending a
biographies
moment on
describe
what
Johnson
Harlem
as
looked
having
like
cultivated
at that
that
point,
standing
since
deliberately.
it helps explain why
He's said to
Johnson
have
had
quietly
the kind of
held
standing
families
he
behind on
apparently
rent,
did.
donated to
Neighborhood's
local
cultural
churches,
high point in
and
the
made sure his
1920s
own runners were
had
paid
faded
fairly,
considerably,
which apparently
by the
wasn't
early
universal in
1940s.
that line of work.
The Depression
None
hit
of this
Harlem
is offered
harder
here
than a
as
lot
an
of the rest
endorsement
of
of the
the
man
city.
or the business he
Unemployment
ran.
ran high.
He
and
operated
many of
an
the
illegal
businesses
gambling
that had once
enterprise,
defined the
had
area's
used
main
violence
streets
when he
had
judged it
closed.
necessary.
Against
and
that
had served
backdrop,
real prison time
historians
as a
who
result.
study the numbers
But the
racket
reputation
generally
he
describe
apparently
it as
held in
something more
Harlem was
complicated
different from
than
how the
simple
Genovese
criminal
family reportedly
exploitation.
viewed him. And
For
that
a lot of
gap in
people who
perception
played,
is
it
central
functioned
to
as
how
one
this
of the
conflict
only
is
accessible
generally
forms of
understood
hope
to have
available
unfolded.
on an ordinary day.
This is
A small,
roughly the point
affordable,
where,
recurring
according to
chance
most
to turn
versions
a
of this
nickel
story,
or a quarter
the
into
Genovese
something
family's
meaningful.
patience with the
That
situation
context
ran
matters,
out,
because it's
nobody
part of why
downtown
the men who ran these
by most
operations
accounts
responsibly
particularly
could develop
wanted
a kind
an
of
open
standing in
in their communities that had
organizations
little to do with how the law viewed them. It drew police attention. Several biographies described Johnson as having cultivated that standing deliberately. It risked something the families were quietly cared about even behind on rent, which was staying off the radar of federal investigators and made sure his own runners were paid fairly, actively looking into organized crime in that line of work as part of a broader wartime effort here as against anything of resembling corruption or disorder on the home front. He operated an illegal gambling enterprise, at least initially, used violence generally described necessary, businesslike, and served rather than confrontational as a result. Costello, but the reputation in Genovese's held in Harlem was different from how the Genovese family reported widely
that
viewed
several
him,
accounts
and that
describe
gap
as
in perception
unusually
is central
generous
to how this
by
conflict is
Underworld
generally
standards.
understood to have unfolded.
Johnson could reportedly keep
This
running
is
his
roughly
operation,
the point where,
keep his people
according
and
to
his
most
territory,
versions of this story,
in exchange for splitting
the Genovese
profits
family's
roughly
patience
evenly
with the
with the
situation
Genovese
ran
family,
out,
who would in turn
nobody
offer
downtown,
protection from
by
police
most
pressure
accounts,
and keep
particularly
other
wanted
operators
in
out of
open
Harlem.
conflict.
It's
War
not hard to
between
see why the
organizations
family
was
apparently
expensive.
believed this
It
was
drew police
reasonable.
attention.
50-50
And in
arrangements
1942
were
and
common
1943,
between the commission
it
and
risked
smaller
something the
operators
families
around the
reportedly
city
cared
cared about
about
even more,
and most people
which
in
was staying
Johnson's
off the
position,
radar of
facing
federal
potential
investigators
conflict
who
with
were,
the largest
at
criminal
that time,
network in the country,
actively looking into
would likely have
organized
accepted
crime
the terms
as
without
part of a
much
broader
resistance.
wartime effort
According to
against
most
anything
tellings,
resembling corruption
Johnson
or
wasn't
disorder on the
interested.
home front.
The
So
specific
the
exchanges
approach,
that
at least
followed,
initially,
are among the
is
least
generally
verifiable
described
parts
as
of the story,
businesslike,
repeated in
rather
various
than
forms
confrontational.
across interviews,
Costello,
later
acting in
biographies,
Genovese's
and oral
absence,
histories, but
is
not
said to have
confirmed by any
authorized an offer to
surviving
Johnson
written record.
that several accounts
According to the
describe
version
as
that's been passed down,
unusually generous.
a messenger delivered
by
the
Underworld
offer,
standards.
and Johnson listened without
Johnson
interruption
could
before
reportedly
rejecting
keep
it
running his
outright,
operation,
reportedly
keep his
making
people
clear
and
that
his
Harlem
territory
wasn't for
in
sale at any
exchange for
price.
splitting profits
Costello
roughly
apparently
evenly
didn't
with the
accept this
Genovese
as
family,
final,
and
who
a
would in
second,
turn offer
more
protection
senior
from
envoy
police
was sent,
pressure,
receiving
keep
other
described
operators
as the
out of
same
Harlem.
response.
It's
A
not
third
hard to see
approach
why
is
the
said to have
family
gone even
apparently
less
believed
far,
this was
with
reasonable.
Johnson declining to meet in
50-50
person at all,
arrangements were
and
common
instead
between
sending
the
word
commission
back that the
and
answer
smaller
wouldn't
operators
change
around
no
the
matter
city
how
at
many
the time.
times it was asked.
And most people in
Whether
Johnson's
these
position,
exchanges happened
facing
in exactly
potential
this
conflict
form,
with the
or
largest
whether they've
criminal
been
network in the
smoothed and
country,
dramatized
would
over
likely have
decades of
accepted the
retelling,
terms
is
without much
impossible to
resistance.
say with any
According
confidence
to
now.
most tellings,
What most
Johnson
historians
wasn't
agree
interested.
actually happened.
The
Based on
specific
what
exchanges
followed,
that followed
is that Johnson
are among
refused
the least
the Genovese
verifiable
family's
parts of the
terms,
story, and made that
repeated in
refusal
various
unmistakable
forms across interviews,
which, under the
later
informal
biographies
rules the commission
and oral
operated
histories,
by,
but
amounted
not
to a
confirmed
direct
by any
challenge
surviving
to its
written
authority.
record.
According to the version that's pointed to a practical concern,
a messenger
delivered the
more
offer,
obvious
and
tension
Johnson
in the room
listened
during
without
the commission's
interruption
response,
before rejecting it
something
outright,
less about pride
reportedly
and
making
more about
clear that
arithmetic.
Harlem wasn't for
Removing
sale
Johnson
at any
didn't
price.
guarantee the
Costello
family could simply
apparently
step
didn't
in
accept
and
this
run
as
his
final,
operation in his
and
place.
a second, more
Numbers
senior
banks
envoy
depended
was sent,
heavily on trust
receiving
between
what's
runners
described
and the
as
people
the same
placing
response.
bets.
Trust
third
built
approach
over
is
years
said to have
within
gone even
specific
less far,
blocks and social
with Johnson
circles.
declining to meet in
An
person
outside
at all,
crew could
and
seize
instead
territory,
sending word
but
back
there was a
that the
real
answer
risk
wouldn't
the
change
actual
no
business
matter
would
how many
collapse
times it
along
was
with
asked.
the man who ran it.
Whether these
As
exchanges
runners
happened
scattered
in exactly
and players
this form,
took their money
or
elsewhere,
whether they've been smoothed
that
and dramatized over
according to
decades
some
of
accounts,
retelling,
is
part of
impossible
why
to
the
say
decision
with
to
any
escalate
confidence now.
wasn't made lightly.
What most historians
According
agree
to most
actually
tellings,
happened,
the
based
decision
on
that
what
emerged
followed,
was a
is
form
that
of
Johnson
compromise.
refused the Genovese
Johnson
family's
would be given
terms
30
and made
days
that
to
refusal
reconsider
unmistakable
before the family
which,
moved to
under
what's
the
described in some
rules the
accounts
commission
as
operated by,
direct
amounted
action.
to a direct challenge
Costello
to its
reportedly
authority.
delivered or
Some
arranged for
historians
the
have
delivery
pointed to a
of the
practical
ultimatum
concern around
around
December
December
20th,
obvious tension in the
1942,
room during the commission's
Johnson's response,
something
according
less
to the
about
story
pride
that's
and
usually
more
told,
about arithmetic,
came within about 2
removing
days.
Johnson didn't guarantee
Several
the family could
Italian-run
simply
policy
step in
operators
and run
who
his
had
operation
reportedly
in
been
his
running
place.
unauthorized
Numbers
games
banks
inside
depended
Harlem,
heavily
paying
on trust
tribute
between
downtown
runners and the
rather
people
than to
placing
Johnson,
bets,
were
trust
confronted
built
and
over
beaten
years
badly within
enough,
specific
according to
blocks
most
and
accounts,
social circles
to make a lasting
An
impression.
outside crew could
Though the
seize
specific
territory,
details of this
but there was a
episode
real risk
are among the
actual
parts of
business
this story
would
historians
collapse
treat
along with the man who ran it. One
As
version
runners
holds
scattered
that a note
and players
referencing a
took their money
shortened
elsewhere.
countdown was left
That
with the men
uncertainty,
as a message.
according to some
Whether that
accounts,
detail
is
is
part of
accurate
why
in
the
its
decision to
specifics
escalate
or has
wasn't
simply
made
become
lightly.
part of how the story is
According
retold
to
over
most
the
tellings,
decades. The
isn't
decision that
something that can
emerged
be
was a
confirmed
form
today.
of compromise.
What most
Johnson
accounts
would
agree
be
on
given 30
is that
days
Costello
to
and the
reconsider
rest of the
before
commission
the family moved
understood
to
this
what's
response
described in
as
some
more than a
accounts
stalling
as
tactic.
direct
It
action.
read, by most
Costello
interpretations,
reportedly delivered
as a rejection
or arranged for the
paired with a
delivery
warning
of the
suggesting
ultimatum
Johnson
around
would rather
December
fight
20th
than surrender
1942,
Harlem, and that he believed
Johnson's
he could
response,
either win outright
according to the
or
story
make the
that's
cost of winning too high within about 2 days. By conventional Underworld logic of policy operators, this who had reportedly been running unauthorized games inside Harlem, refusing the commission downtown, and repeating that refusal wasn't something people generally survived without consequence, according to most accounts. But to make a lasting impression, supported by how events are generally described as having played out parts of the story in which Johnson wasn't acting recklessly at all. One version holds that historians and biographers countdown he understood the men about Harlem's dynamics, whether that detail is accurate in its specific experience or has the rest of the city part of how the story is retold over the decades. The family's downtown that can be controlled today, largely through a mix of fear and corruption, is that Costello and the rest of the commission, with people who understood this response generally as more than a stalling tactic.
Harlem, according to most accounts,
by most interpretations,
somewhat differently,
as a rejection,
the relationship
between the neighborhood and the police,
suggesting Johnson
was already
would rather
strained
fight
for reasons that
surrender
predated
Harlem,
this conflict
and that he
entirely,
believed he could either
which
win
limited how
outright
effectively
or
the
make the
usual
cost of
tools
winning
control
too high to be
translated
worth it.
uptown.
What
By
Johnson
conventional
reportedly
underworld
had
logic
instead
of the period,
was a working
this
form
looked
of
like an extremely
legitimacy
risky
within the
position to
community,
take, seen by many
refusing the
residents
commission
not
openly
simply as an
and
outside
repeating that
predator,
refusal
but as
wasn't
someone
something
who,
people generally
while certainly
survived
profiting
without
from the
consequence,
neighborhood,
also
but
worked
there's a
to keep
reading
it
of
from
the
being
story,
taken over,
supported by
how
people
events
with
are
no
generally
connection to it
described
at
as
all.
having played out afterward.
Several accounts
in which
suggest
Johnson was
acting
betting that the
recklessly at
Genovese
all.
family and
Several
the broader
historians
commission
and biographers
understood the
argue
political
he
risk
understood
of an
something
openly
about
violent
Harlem's dynamics
conflict
breaking
that the
out in a
Genovese
black
family,
neighborhood
for
in
all its experience
1943,
running the rest of
in
the
the
city,
middle of a war
hadn't
effort
fully
that
accounted
was,
for,
at least
the
rhetorically,
families downtown
framed around
maintained
opposing
control,
tyranny
largely
abroad.
through a mix
A
of
visible
fear and corruption,
prolonged
paying
conflict
off
of this
police
kind
and officials,
carried real risk
with people
of drawing
who
the
caused
same
problems
federal
generally
attention
disappearing.
that organized crime
Harlem,
was otherwise
according to
trying
most
to
accounts,
avoid. If
operated
the fight
somewhat
could be made
differently.
costly,
The
and public
relationship
enough,
between the neighborhood
the calculation
and the
for the
police was
commission
already strained
might
for
shift
reasons
toward
that
deciding
predated
the
this
conflict
wasn't
entirely,
worth the price
which
of winning
limited
it.
how effectively
That,
the usual tools
according
of
to
control
most versions of
translated
this
uptown.
story, was
What
the
Johnson
bet.
reportedly had
31
instead
days
was
after
a
the
working
ultimatum
form of
on
legitimacy
January
within
15th,
the community,
1943,
seen by many residents,
the deadline
not
is said to
simply
have
as an
passed,
outside
with
predator,
no sign
but as
that
someone
Johnson
who,
intended to
while
back
certainly
down.
profiting from the neighborhood,
According to most accounts,
also worked
the
to keep
commission
it
met
from
again,
being taken over,
and this time
by people with
the
no
tone had
connection to
reportedly
it at all.
shifted from negotiation
Several accounts
towards
something
suggest
closer
Johnson
to an
was betting that
operational
the Genovese
decision.
family and
Costello
the broader
is
commission
said to have
understood
authorized
the
direct
political
action
risk
and
of an
assigned
openly
responsibility
violent
for it
conflict
to Albert
breaking out in a
Anastasia,
black neighborhood
who, by
in
most historical
1943,
accounts, in the
oversaw
middle of a war
enforcement
effort
matters
that
for the
was,
broader
at
commission,
least rhetorically,
and had a long-standing
framed around
reputation,
opposing tyranny
even
abroad.
among people accustomed
A
to
visible,
violence,
prolonged
for approaching
conflict
it
of
with
this kind
unusual
carried
detachment.
real risk of drawing the same
Contemporary
federal
and later
attention
accounts
that
generally
organized crime
describe
was
Anastasia
otherwise trying
as
to
someone
avoid.
who treated
If the
violent
fight could be
assignments
made
the way
costly
other people
and
treated
public enough,
administrative
the
work,
calculation for the commission
and without
might
much
shift
apparent
toward deciding the
reflection on
conflict
the wider
wasn't worth the
consequences.
price of winning it.
He'd built a reputation carrying out
according to
jobs
most
across
versions of
family
this story,
lines when the commission
bet.
needed something handled without
31
being
days
traced
after
back
the
to a
ultimatum,
single organization,
on January 15th,
which is part of why he's said to have been the one assigned
the deadline
to this
is said to have
situation,
passed,
where
with no
others
sign
reportedly
that Johnson
hesitated
intended
over
to
the
back
risk
down.
of unrest in Harlem.
According to most
Anastasia
accounts,
is
the commission
generally
met
described
again,
as having
and this
approached
time
the assignment
the tone had
narrowly,
reportedly shifted
as a problem
from
to be
negotiation
resolved rather than
towards
a political
something closer
question
to an operational decision.
The plan that's generally
Costello is
described
said
in
to
most
have authorized
retellings was
direct
methodical
action and
rather
assigned
than
responsibility for it to
rather
Albert
than
Anastasia,
approach Johnson
who,
directly,
by most
given that
historical
he was
accounts,
by this point
oversaw
surrounded by
enforcement
people
matters
loyal
for the
enough to
broader
warn him
commission,
of almost anything,
and had a long-standing
the plan
reputation,
reportedly targeted
even
his
among people
closest
accustomed to
lieutenant,
violence,
a man
for
most
approaching
accounts
it with
referred to as
unusual
Junie
detachment,
Bird, who is said to have
Contemporary
overseen
and
daily
later
operations
accounts
generally
Johnson's
describe
policy
Anastasia
banks,
as someone
and kept
who
a
treated
regular
violent
Friday night
assignments
habit
the way
at a
other
card
people
game
treated
at the Rhythm
administrative
Club
work
on 132nd
competently
Street,
and without much
according to the
apparent
story,
reflection.
The
on
aim
the
was
wider
to take Bird
consequences.
somewhere private.
He'd built a
question
reputation
him, and
carrying
use
out
whatever
jobs
information
across
came
family
from that
lines when
to
the
move
commission
against
needed
Johnson
something handled
directly,
without being
a crew
traced
of
back
several
to a
men
single organization,
described in most
which is
accounts
part
as
of why he's
experienced
said to have been
operators,
the one
was
assigned to
assembled
this
for the
situation.
job.
Where
What
others
that crew
reportedly hesitated over the
and
risk
had
of
no
unrest
realistic
in Harlem,
way of knowing
Anastasia
was that Johnson
is generally
maintained an
described as
extensive
having
network
approached
of
the
informants
assignment
across the
narrowly,
city,
as a
including
problem to be
police
resolved
officers
rather
who
than
took
a
mob
political
money
question
while
to be
quietly
weighed.
passing information
The plan
to him,
that's generally
along with
described in
bartenders
most
and
retellings
associates
was
who
methodical
traded
rather
gossip
than
for
reckless.
favors.
Rather
According
than
to most
approach
accounts,
Johnson directly,
Johnson learned
given
of
that
the
he was
plan
by
by
this
this
point
point well
surrounded
before
by
it took
people
place,
loyal enough to
and
warn
had
him
time
of
to
almost
prepare a
anything.
response.
The plan
What happened
reportedly
on the night
targeted
of
his
January
closest
15th
lieutenant,
is
a man
among
the
the
most
most
dramatized
dramatized
parts
parts
as
of
Junie
story,
Bird,
and
who
the
is said
surviving
to have
accounts
overseen
vary in
daily
their level of
operations
detail.
for Johnson's
According
policy
to the
banks,
general version
and
that's
kept
been
a
passed
regular
down,
Friday night
the card
habit
game
at a
proceeded
card
as
game
normal
at the Rhythm Club,
while armed
on
associates of
132nd
Johnson
Street
waited nearby. According to the
Both
story,
inside the building
aim was to take
and
Bird
on the
somewhere
surrounding
private,
streets,
question him,
the visiting
and
crew
use whatever
arrived
information
close to
came from
midnight
that and
to
entered
move
without
against
difficulty.
Johnson directly.
What followed,
A crew of several
according to
men,
most retellings,
described in most
was a
accounts
short,
as experienced
violent
operators,
confrontation,
was
and by the
assembled
time
for the
it
job.
ended, several members
What
of
that
the
crew
visiting crew were
reportedly
dead,
didn't know,
and the
and had
rest
no
had fled
realistic
the
way
scene
of knowing,
wounded, was that
it's
Johnson
worth being
maintained
direct
an
about
extensive
how much of this
network of
particular
informants
episode
across the
rests
city,
on second-hand
including
and
police
third-hand
officers
storytelling
who took
rather
rather
than
than
documented
quietly
record.
passing information to
No
him,
official police
along with
report or
bartenders
court
and
proceeding
associates
that
who
fully
traded
corroborates
gossip
the
for
details
favors.
of this confrontation.
According to most
has
accounts,
surfaced in the sources
Johnson
this
learned
story
of the
draws
planned
on,
operation
and
well
some
before it
historians
took
treat the
place,
entire
and had
episode
time
with
to
real
prepare a
skepticism.
response. noting that stories like January 15th tend to grow more dramatic among the more dramatized parts of this story, in a community that had the surviving accounts to vary in their level of detail. What according to the general version that's been passed somewhat more confidence, the card game proceeded as normal. Some kind of violent confrontation took place around this period involving Johnson's people and on the surrounding streets, and that it ended. The visiting crew arrived close to midnight, according to the story, without difficulty. As it's usually told. What followed, Johnson's people, according to allowed the survivors to leave, was a short and violent confrontation. Apparently, and as a deliberate choice, several members of the visiting crew of what happened and made its way back downtown. Fled the scene wounded. Some accounts describe a message about how much of this particular episode rests on second-hand and third-hand storytelling, different retellings, rather than documented varies enough that it shouldn't be treated as a verified quotation or proceeding. What's clear, fully regardless of the details of this confrontation, is that an outcome like in the sources this story draws precise shape, and some historians treat the entire episode with real skepticism. By the commission were not expected that stories like confrontations like tend to grow more dramatic. Something along these lines apparently happened in a community that created a serious problem for the Genovese family that had less to do with Johnson personally and more to do with what other people watching from outside. Some kind of violent confrontation took place around this period, according to most Johnson's people. The commission met that same night again, and that it ended badly for the mood than before. Several men were reportedly dead, as it's usually told, and the loss couldn't easily be allowed the survivors to leave without risking rather than pursuing the kind of perception the families wanted to avoid. Intended to ensure word of what authorized further action back downtown, but also made a separate decision that mattered more in the long run, with the survivors, choosing to keep the matter as quiet as possible when it appears at all in different retellings that Johnson had defeated enough that it shouldn't be treated as a verified no consequences. What's other clear, groups operating on the margins of the city's underworld, is that an Jewish organizations in Brooklyn, whatever its Irish gangs elsewhere, was might start to question whether the commission's authority by the commission were not expected to lose confrontations like this. The apparent goal, and when something along these lines apparently was for the situation to look less like a problem for the Genovese Johnson's organization to do with Johnson fading out over time, and more to do with what other people watching from outside of the story might conclude about the commission's authority, because word of the confrontation reportedly spread through Harlem within days, in a considerably different mood than before. Several men were reportedly dead or wounded, barbershops, and the lost couldn't easily be social gatherings across the neighborhood, exactly the kind of perception the families wanted to avoid. As these stories tend Costello is said to have authorized further action of any given also detail. Made a separate decision that mattered more in the long run was significant. Choosing to keep the matter as quiet as became something close to a folk figure in Harlem that Johnson had defeated a crew sent by many residents and faced no consequences. Stood up to organized outside interests on the margins of the city's underworld. It's worth noting Jewish organizations like this aren't Irish gangs a matter of admiration. Might start to question whether the commission's authority was as absolute as it had long appeared. The story were probably less interested in celebrating Johnson was for the situation everyone around them understood who controlled the Johnson's organization simply fading out over time. To change that. That plan, either way, according to most versions of the story, made further moves against Johnson because word of the confrontation to carry out reportedly spread through Harlem. Visitors to Harlem were now more likely to be noticed and reported. The story is said to have circulated through barbershops. Anastasia's churches made several further attempts across the following weeks, likely growing somewhat unsuccessful in different ways. Stories tend to, though the specific details of these episodes are any given detail and should be read as part of the broader legend around this conflict. Johnson reportedly became something close to after roughly a month without success overnight. The strategy is seen by many residents from confrontation who had stood up to organized outside interests beginning in February 1943. It's worth noting that reputations like this, Johnson's operations across Harlem faced sustained and organized harassment, and some of the people who repeated the story were probably less interested in celebrating Johnson than in making sure everyone around them understood who controlled the neighborhood, runners arrested, and what happened to outsiders arrangements that normally allowed the operation to run smoothly. The reputation reportedly made as rival interests against Johnson considerably harder to carry out, since outside visitors to Harlem were now more likely to be noticed, received less attention in most accounts, because Anastasia's people made several further attempts over the following weeks of sustained pressure applied unsuccessful in different ways. And the specific details of these episodes are thinly sourced and should be read as part of the broader legend around this one of the more historically plausible parts of the story. since sustained police harassment without black-run gambling operations said to have shifted from confrontation well documented as a pattern during this period, beginning in February 1943, aside the specifics of this particular conflict. Johnson's operations across Harlem faced pressure had a real effect and organized harassment. Johnson's income reportedly dropped substantially within a few weeks. The Genovese family and some of his associates are said to have wavered. Policy banks were operators reportedly shifting allegiance toward Italian-backed and the informal arrangements that Johnson allowed the operation to run respond to police pressure with violence. Rival interests. Direct action against police officials or local politicians previously relied on. Exactly the kind of federal exposure both sides were trying to avoid. In most retellings, what he reportedly had instead no single dramatic scene of accumulated knowledge about corruption sustained within the system around him through paperwork, knowledge of which officers took arrangements made quietly, which officials had arrangements they wouldn't want downtown contacts. According to most accounts, arguably one of the more historically plausible parts of the story, trusted intermediaries, sustained police harassment, that documentation of this gambling operations could reach federal investigators is well documented as a pattern during this period at a time. Even those same investigators of this were already looking closely at organized crime as a part of wartime anti-corruption efforts. Johnson's income reportedly dropped this specific mechanism is described and some of his associates are said to have wavered. The broader claim that Johnson used reportedly shifting allegiance toward Italian rather than competitors to blunt the pressure against him. What Johnson apparently couldn't do was respond to several historians characterize his approach direct action against police officials. According to most versions of the story, this shift changed the calculation of federal exposure both sides. The Genovese family reportedly could no longer move against Johnson without risking exposure of exactly the kind of corruption federal investigators were already circling. Knowledge of which officers took payoffs reportedly couldn't operate and which officials had arrangements they wouldn't want made public. By March 1943, he began quietly generally described as having settled into a stalemate. That documentation of this corruption and unlikely could reach federal investigators. What is said to have finally forced a resolution at a time a deliberate strategy on either side, but an already looking closely at organized human mistake that ends up mattering more than any amount of planning. According to most accounts, this specific mechanism is described accurately James O'Brien. The broader taking money from both Johnson and the Genovese family simultaneously, rather than force, and to blunt the pressure heavily one night, is consistent with how several historians characterize his approach more generally. Payoffs, according to most versions of the story, what he apparently changed the calculation on both sides to federal investigators. The Genovese family reportedly could no longer move against Johnson without risking exposure of exactly the kind of corruption federal investigators were already circling. It's worth pausing on how small and human this particular turning point under continued police pressure. Two organizations with substantial resources, the conflict was generally described as having settled into a stalemate that was costly for both sides, rival's careful strategy, unlikely to hold for long. Through one tired, what is said to have finally forced a resolution, couldn't keep a private deliberate strategy on either side. Whatever the precise accuracy of this detail, the kind of ordinary human mistake that ends up mattering more than any amount of planning, undone by ordinary carelessness rather than clever opposition, sometimes named as common one across organized crime had been taking money from both Johnson and the Genovese family simultaneously. Federal agents soon began asking after drinking heavily about mob activity in Harlem. Reportedly told his girlfriend the details of the ongoing conflict taking place during a war effort the country was publicly united. What he apparently didn't know for both Johnson and Costello to federal investigators. This reportedly changed the calculation entirely. Is said to have eventually neither side could afford already paying close attention to organized crime activity in New York either. Given what each had at stake in the eyes of their own this particular turning point, both sides apparently needed two organizations with substantial resources to broker years of experience without either side appearing to lose. Reportedly exposed, according to most versions of the story, that role was filled by one tired, indiscreet police operator Johnson had once private conversation who had maintained relationships across both the black and Italian underworlds, the underlying stepping back from active organizations, undone by ordinary carelessness, usually rather than clever opposition, arranged a meeting on common ground across organized crime history more broadly, chosen because according to most accounts from such a place, federal agents without began asking pointed questions about mob activity in the early hours of a morning in mid-April, and an ongoing conflict taking place during a war effort the country was publicly united behind. St. Clair reportedly laid out the situation plainly. This reportedly changed the calculation entirely. Money and drawing neither side could afford federal attention, neither could be seen backing down, and that the conflict had become, in practical terms, each had at stake a matter of pride of their own people, rather than anything both sides apparently currently needed was a mediator trusted enough by
position
each
in this
to
story
broker an
deserves
agreement
particular
without
attention,
either side
since
appearing
she wasn't
to lose.
simply a convenient
According to
neutral
most
party.
versions of the
She had
story,
reportedly
that
faced
role
a
was filled
similar
by
situation
Stephanie St.
herself,
Clair,
roughly
the
a decade
same
earlier,
operator Johnson
when
had once
Dutch
worked
Schultz
for,
attempted to
who
take
had
her own
maintained
numbers
relationships
operations
across
by
both
force,
the black and
which several
Italian underworlds
historians suggest
even
gave
after
her an
stepping back
unusually
from
clear
active
understanding
operations.
of both sides of this
According
kind
to
of
the
story,
story,
as it's usually
the
told,
operator being
St. Clair
pressured to give
arranged
up
a meeting
territory
on neutral ground,
and the organization
reportedly
applying
a funeral
that pressure.
home in the Bronx,
According to
chosen
most
because
accounts,
people came and
the
went from
negotiation
such a
that
place
followed
constantly
wasn't
without
calm
drawing
throughout,
attention, with
the
reported
meeting is
moments
said
of
to have taken
disagreement
place in the
and at
early
least
hours
one
of a
account
morning
describing
in
a
mid-April
threat by one
1943
side
to
with
walk
a
away
small number
entirely.
of associates
What's
present
generally
on each
agreed
side
to have kept both
St. Clair
sides at the
reportedly
table
laid out
wasn't
the situation
goodwill
plainly,
so much as the repeated
that both sides
practical
were losing
recognition
money and
that
drawing
neither could
exactly
afford
the
to keep
kind of
fighting.
federal attention neither
According
could
to
afford,
most versions of the story,
and that the conflict
the agreement
had
that
become,
eventually
in practical
emerged
terms,
allowed Harlem's
a matter
numbers
of pride,
operation to
rather
remain
than
under
anything
Johnson's
either
control,
side could
with
still
Johnson
meaningfully
reportedly
win.
agreeing to pay
St.
a
Clair's
share of
position in
profits
this
to the
story
Genovese
deserves
family,
particular attention,
described in most
since
accounts
she wasn't
as
somewhere
simply a
around
convenient
15%
neutral party, rather than
she had
the
reportedly
50%
faced a similar
originally
situation
proposed.
herself.
In
Roughly a
exchange,
decade earlier,
police pressure was
when
said to
Dutch
ease,
Schultz attempted
and
to take her
Johnson
own numbers
reportedly
operation
received
by
some
force,
informal degree of
which
protection,
several historians
and a
suggest
voice in
gave her an
decisions
unusually
affecting
clear
Harlem going
understanding
forward.
of both sides
If
of this
this
kind
figure
of
is
conflict.
accurate,
It
the operator
represents
being
a notably
pressured to give
different
up
arrangement
territory
than the one
and the
first
organization
proposed,
applying that
small
pressure.
enough that Johnson
According to
retained
most
the large
accounts,
majority
the
of what his
negotiation that
operation
followed
generated,
wasn't
but
calm
large
throughout,
enough to give the
with
Genovese
reported
family
moments
a
of
genuine
disagreement
financial
and at
interest
least one
in the
account
operation's
describing a
continued
threat
success
by one side
rather
to
than
walk
its
away
destruction.
entirely.
Several
generally
accounts
agreed
suggest
to have
this
kept
shift
both
mattered
sides at the
enormously,
table wasn't
converting what had
goodwill
been an
so much
attempt
as
at
the
forced
repeated
takeover
practical
into something
recognition
closer to
that
an
neither
ongoing
could afford
business
to keep
relationship.
fighting.
Since
According
protecting
to
a
most
smaller
versions
share
of
of
the
a stable,
story, the
functioning
agreement that
operation
eventually
was,
emerged
in practical
allowed
terms,
Harlem's numbers
likely worth
operation
more
to
than
remain
continuing
under
to fight
Johnson's
for a
control,
larger share
with
of one
Johnson
under constant
reportedly
disruption.
agreeing to pay a
Some
share of
retellings
profits
of this
to the
story
Genovese
include
family,
a further detail
described in most
that a
accounts
secret
as
understanding
somewhere around
existed between a
50%
small number
rather
of people
than the
involved,
50%
under which
originally
any
proposed.
violation of the new
In
arrangement
exchange,
would result
police
in
pressure was said to
documentation being
ease,
released
and
to
Johnson
federal authorities.
reportedly received some
Whether this
informal
specific
degree
clause
of protection
existed in the form
and a
usually
voice in
described
decisions
isn't
affecting
something
Harlem
that can be
going forward.
verified, though the
If
broader
this figure
idea
is accurate,
that both
it
sides
represents
retained
a
enough
notably
leverage
different
over the other
arrangement
to
to
make
the one
betrayal
first
costly
proposed,
is
small enough
consistent
that
with
Johnson
how the
retained
agreement
his
is
generally
largely
described
described
as
as
having
having
held
held
up
up
over the
over
following
but
months.
large enough to give the
According
Genovese
to most
family
accounts,
a genuine
the
financial
arrangement was
interest
tested
in the
almost
operation's
immediately,
continued success.
within days of the
rather than
agreement
its
reportedly
destruction.
being reached.
Several
in
accounts
mid-April
suggest this
1943,
shift mattered
one of
enormously,
Anastasia's
converting
subordinates,
what had been
said
an
to be
attempt at
unhappy
forced
with what he
takeover
saw as
into
an
something closer
unacceptable
to an
compromise,
ongoing business
allegedly
relationship.
organized a
Since
small
protecting
crew
a smaller
to move
share
against
of a
Johnson
stable,
independently
functioning
of the new
operation
agreement.
was, in practical
According to the
terms,
story,
likely
Johnson's
worth more
people
than continuing
intercepted
to
this
fight
crew
for a
before
larger
they
share
reached
of
him.
one under constant
What Johnson
disruption.
is said to have
Some
done
retellings
next
of this
is treated
story
by several
include a
accounts
further
as the
detail
real test
that
of
a
whether the
secret
new
understanding
arrangement
would
existed
hold,
between a
rather
small
than
number
treat
of
the
people
incident
involved.
as grounds to
Under
resume
which any
open
violation
conflict.
of the new
He
arrangement
reportedly
would
returns
result
the
in
man involved
documentation
to
being
Anastasia
released to
rather
federal
than
authorities.
resolving the matter himself.
Whether this specific
along
clause
with
existed
information
in the
gathered
form
during
usually
questioning,
described isn't
effectively
something that can
placing
be
responsibility
verified, though
for
the broader
enforcing the
idea
new agreement
that both
back on the
sides retained
Genovese
enough
family
leverage
itself.
over the other to
According
make
to
betrayal
most versions
costly
of the story,
is consistent
the man's
with how
body
the
was
agreement
found in
is
the East
generally
River,
described
not
as having
long
held up
afterward,
over the following
understood
months.
by most accounts,
According
as a
to most
signal
accounts,
that Anastasia
the
had
arrangement was
enforced
tested
discipline
almost
within his
immediately,
own organization
within days
to
of the
preserve the
agreement with
reportedly
Johnson.
being reached
If
in
accurate,
mid-April
this
1943.
detail is considered
One of
significant by
Anastasia's
several
subordinates
historians,
said to be
since
unhappy
it would
with
mark
what
a
he
notable
saw as
moment
an
in which the
unacceptable
commission
compromise,
demonstrated
allegedly
willingness to
organized a
discipline its
small
own
crew
people to move against
specifically
Johnson
to maintain an
independently of the
arrangement
new
with an
agreement.
operator outside
According to
its
the
traditional
story,
structure.
Johnson's people intercepted following year or so, they reached according to most accounts. What Johnson is said to have done Johnson and the Genovese several accounts as the real test something of whether the new arrangement would hold. One that some historians argue as grounds to resume other open conflict outside the Italian-led hierarchy. The man involved came to understand their own possible resolving the matter himself. Along with information gathered during questioning, the Italian families remained the dominant force for enforcing the organized crime landscape on the Genovese family itself. And this single episode versions didn't rewrite that structure. The man's body was found several in the East River, suggest not long complicate a previously by most accounts assumption as a signal that profitable territory outside the traditional family structure organization could simply be taken by force with Johnson whenever the commission decided to do so. This detail is considered later estimate by several Johnson's operation was generating a substantial weekly income in which the commission demonstrated willingness to discipline the Genovese family, reportedly collecting and maintaining an arrangement with an ongoing outside despite its traditional structure.
Johnson, meanwhile,
over the following
retained
year or so,
operational
according to
control
most
of Harlem,
accounts,
while now
the arrangement between Johnson and the Genovese
rather
family
than its hostility,
functioned as something
a
close
status
to a
several
working
accounts
model,
describe as
one
making
that
him
some historians
considerably more
argue
difficult for
influenced
anyone
how
else
other
to
groups
challenge
outside
afterward.
the Italian-led
A story
hierarchy
that circulates in
came
several
to understand
biographies,
their own
though it should be
possible
read as
relationships
exactly
with the
that
commission
rather than a documented
this
event.
shouldn't be overstated.
Describes a dinner
The
between
Italian
Costello and
families
Johnson,
remained the dominant
roughly a
force
year
in
after
New
the
York's
original
organized
ultimatum,
crime landscape
at the same restaurant where the conflict is said to have
single
begun,
episode
during which Costello
structure,
reportedly acknowledged
but several accounts
that what had
suggest
initially
it
looked
did
like a foolish
complicate
decision
a
on
previously
Johnson's part
unquestioned assumption
had turned out
that profitable
in hindsight
territory
to be the
outside
smarter
traditional
move all
family
along.
structure.
Whether
Could
this
simply be
conversation
taken by
happened
force
in anything
whenever the
resembling this
commission
form
decided
is
to do so.
impossible to confirm.
By some
and
later
readers should
estimates,
treat it as
part of the
Johnson's
legend
operation
that grew
was
up
generating
around
a
the story,
substantial
rather
weekly
than
income within
established
roughly a
historical
year
fact.
of the agreement.
What historians
with the
generally
Genovese
agree
family
on,
reportedly
with more
collecting its
confidence than
agreed
most
share
of the
for
specific
little
scenes
ongoing
described
risk
above,
or effort,
is the broader
Johnson,
outcome.
meanwhile,
Some
retained
kind of
operational
conflict
control
took
of
place
Harlem
in 1943
while now carrying
between
the
elements of the Genovese family
rather
and
than
Harlem's
its
numbers
hostility,
operation,
a status
under
several
Bumpy
accounts
Johnson.
describe
It
as
appears,
making him
based
considerably
on
more
available
difficult
evidence,
for
to
anyone
have
else to
ended not
challenge
in Johnson's
afterward.
removal,
A story
but
that
in some
circulates
form
in
of
several
negotiated
biographies,
arrangement,
though
that
it should be
left him
read
in
as
control
exactly
of his
that
territory,
rather than a
while
documented
establishing
event.
an ongoing
Describes a
financial
dinner between
relationship
Costello
with
and
the
Johnson,
Genovese family.
roughly a
The
year after the
specific
original
mechanics,
ultimatum.
the messengers,
At the same restaurant
the
where the
notes,
conflict
the
is said
funeral
to have
home
begun,
meeting, the
during
exact
which
percentage,
Costello
the
reportedly
fate of the
acknowledged
rogue captain
that what had
rest
initially looked like
largely
a
on
foolish
accounts
decision
written
on
or
Johnson's part,
recounted, well
turned
after
out,
the fact,
in
some
hindsight,
contradicting
to be
each
the
other in
smarter
minor
move
ways,
all along,
and should be
whether this
understood
conversation
as the legend
happened
that
in
formed
anything
around a
resembling
real
this
and
form
significant,
is impossible
but
to
only
confirm,
partially
and
documented
readers should treat
event.
it as part of the legend
Bumpy
that
Johnson
grew up
went
around
on
to
to
have
story
a long
rather
and
than an
complicated
established
life
historical
afterward,
fact,
including
what
further
historians
prison time,
generally agree
shifting
on,
alliances,
with more confidence
and eventually
than most of the
a level of
specific
recognition
scenes
in Harlem
described
that
above,
outlasted
is the broader
him well
outcome.
beyond his death.
Some
in
kind of conflict
1968,
took place,
the
in
circumstances of which
1943,
are still
between
debated by
elements of the
people who
Genovese
study this
family
period,
and Harlem's
some
numbers
accounts
operation
describe later
under Bumpy
friction
Johnson.
between Johnson
It
and
appears,
Vito Genovese
based on
himself,
available evidence,
once
to
Genovese
have ended
eventually
not in
returned to the
Johnson's
United
removal,
States,
but in
and
some
resumed
form of
control of the
negotiated
family that
arrangement
carried his name,
that left him in
though
control of
details
his
here
territory,
again vary
while
by
establishing
source.
an ongoing financial
What's easy to
relationship
miss,
with the
looking
Genovese
back at
family.
this story from a
The
considerable
specific
distance,
mechanics,
is
the
how
messengers,
quietly the actual
the
turning
notes,
point
the
is
funeral
generally
home meeting,
described as
the
having
exact
occurred.
percentage,
There was no
the fate
single
of the
announced
rogue
moment,
captain,
no
rest
headline
largely
anyone
on
could
accounts
point to
written
at the
or
time.
recounted.
According
well
to
after
most
the
accounts,
fact, some
it was a series
contradicting
of
each other
smaller
in minor
decisions,
ways,
a
and should be
rejected
understood
offer,
as the
a
legend
violent
that formed around a
confrontation
real
that
and
didn't go as
significant,
planned for the
but
crew
only
involved,
partially documented,
an agreement
event.
negotiated quietly.
Bumpy Johnson
and
went on
tested
to have
almost
a
immediately
long and
afterward.
complicated life
None of it looked
afterward,
especially
including further
significant
prison
while it was
time,
reportedly
shifting
happening.
alliances.
It took
and
years
eventually
and
a
a
level
good
of
deal of
recognition
retelling
in Harlem that
for people to
outlasted
look
him
back
well
and treat
beyond
it
his
as
death
one of the
in
clearer
1968,
examples of how
the
assumptions
circumstances
about
of
who
which
controlled
are still
which parts
debated
of
by
the city
people
had
who
begun
study this period.
slowly
Some
and
accounts
unevenly
describe
to
later
shift.
friction between Johnson
According to
and
most
Vito
accounts,
Genovese
this
himself.
1943
Once
conflict
Genovese
became
eventually
the episode
returned to the
most
United
closely
States
associated
and
with
resumed
how
control
Bumpy
of the
Johnson
family
is
that
remembered,
carried his name,
not primarily
though
because
details
of the
here
violence
again
involved,
vary by
which
source.
historians generally note
What's
wasn't
easy to
unusual
miss,
for
looking
organized
back at
crime
this
during
story
this
from a
period,
considerable
but because
distance,
of what the
is how
outcome is said to
quietly the
represent.
actual turning point is
His
generally
supporters,
described as
according
having
to several
occurred.
accounts,
There was no
believed
single
his
announced
greatest
moment,
strength, no
wasn't
headline
force,
anyone
but
could point
patience,
to at the time,
the ability to
according
wait,
to most accounts,
to gather information,
it was a series of
and to
smaller
make the cost
decisions,
of disrespecting
a rejected
him
offer,
higher
a
than the
violent
cost of accepting
confrontation
him as
that
a
didn't
partner.
go as planned.
Whether
for the
every
crew involved,
detail of how that
an
played
agreement
out is
negotiated
accurate
quietly
in the way it's
and
usually
tested
told,
almost immediately
the broader
afterward.
claim,
None
that
of it
an
looked
operator
especially
from Harlem
significant
forced
while
one of
it
New
was
York's most
reportedly
powerful
happening.
crime
It
families
took years
to negotiate,
and a good deal of
rather
retelling
than simply take
for
what it
people
wanted,
to look back and
is
treat
one
it
that
as
most
one of the
historians
clearer
treat as
examples of how
substantially
assumptions
true,
about who
even where
controlled
the
which
specific
parts of the
scenes
city
Bumpy had begun, illustrate it, remain, slowly in the end, unevenly, difficult to fully verify. According to most accounts, this 1943 conflict became the episode most closely associated with how Bumpy Johnson is remembered, not primarily because of the violence involved, which historians generally note wasn't unusual for organized crime during this period, but because of what the outcome is said to represent. His supporters, according to several accounts, believed his greatest strength wasn't force but patience, the ability to wait, to gather information, and to make the cost of disrespecting him higher than the cost of accepting him as a partner. Whether every detail of how that played out is accurate in the way it's usually told, the broader claim, that an operator from Harlem forced one of New York's most powerful crime families to negotiate, rather than simply take what it wanted, is one that most historians treat as substantially true, even where the specific scenes used to illustrate it remain, in the end, difficult to fully verify.